There's a reason historians still lose sleep over this subject. Real torture machines did not exist in myth or rumor. They were engineered, financed, approved, and deployed by courts, churches, and kings. They killed tens of thousands across Europe alone and scarred countless others whose names never entered the record. These were not accidents of cruelty. They were systems. They were policies. In some cities, executions became weekly entertainment. Crowds gathered early, betting on how long a victim would last. Children sat on shoulders. Vendors sold bread and beer. Families begged officials for mercy, sometimes kneeling in the dirt, sometimes screaming until their voices failed. The answers were almost always the same: silence, procedure, the law must be seen. Pain was not a side effect, pain was the point. In 1632, a condemned man was tied to a wheel in a public square. His bones were smashed one by one over the course of hours. He did not die quickly, he was kept alive deliberately. The crowd stayed until sunset. When darkness fell, they left him there, broken and breathing, as a lesson that would linger long after his body stopped. This is not ancient history. This is not exaggeration. This is documentation. Today you're going to see 20 of the worst torture devices humanity ever created. Not legends, not horror fiction. Real instruments backed by records, eyewitness accounts, and surviving artifacts. Devices that turn justice into spectacle and suffering into law. And by the end, you may wish some of these had never existed. Let's begin. Number 20, the breast ripper. Some punishments leave no body to bury. Others leave wounds that outlast any sentence. The breast ripper did both. Used widely across Central Europe from the late Middle Ages through the 1700s, this device targeted women almost exclusively. Court records show it ordered for accusations of adultery, abortion, infanticide, and witchcraft. In practice, it often punished scandal rather than crime. The device itself was simple and terrifying, forged from iron, 4 hooked claws mounted on a hinge. No two were exactly alike. Local blacksmiths shaped them by hand, adding small variations that became grim signatures. Some claws curved inward like talons. Others were flattened and sharpened, designed to tear rather than pierce. The sentence followed a ritual meant to erase hope step by step. First, the woman was brought before town officials. Charges were read aloud. Crowds pressed in from every side. There was no privacy. Exposure was part of the punishment. Her clothing was cut away from the chest. The iron device was clamped cold against bare flesh. Eyewitness accounts describe a pause here, a moment where time seemed to stretch. Then the executioner pulled. The claws bit deep. One wrench tore tissue away, often down to bone. In some cases, both breasts were ripped in sequence. In others, the tearing continued until the victim collapsed. Augsburg, 1599. A chronicler records a silence broken by a single scream, followed by the murmur of the crowd. Surgeons were rarely allowed to intervene. If the device did not kill outright, shock and infection usually finished the job within days. Numbers survive in judicial archives. Wurzburg records list 17 breast-ripping sentences between 1613 and 1634. Italian ecclesiastical courts note dozens more in a single year during peak witch trials. Survival was rare. Those who lived carried scars that marked them permanently, announcing guilt real or invented to every neighbor for the rest of their lives. The symbolism was deliberate. The breast, associated with nourishment and motherhood, was transformed into a site of punishment and control. Some scholars argue the device reflected deep anxiety within patriarchal systems threatened by female autonomy. Others note the imbalance. Men accused of similar crimes were rarely mutilated. By the late 1700s, breast rippers fell out of official use. Legal reforms replaced public mutilation with imprisonment or execution, but the devices did not vanish. They still sit behind glass in museums. Iron claws, hinges rusted shut. Silent proof of a justice system that wanted pain to be visible, memorable, and permanent. And as brutal as this was, it was only the beginning. Because the next punishment didn't rely on tearing flesh. It relied on something far more terrifying: silence. Number 19, the glass coffin. Some punishments force the victim to face their own breath, counting seconds, then counting regrets. The glass coffin exists in both legend and artifact. Its purpose was simple and horrifying: to make the condemned see death coming. Real devices appear in Central European records from the 1600s, used by aristocratic courts and secret tribunals. Unlike dungeons or execution blocks, this punishment was designed for display. The coffin was a transparent chest, often reinforced with iron bands, heavy enough that escape was impossible. Once sealed, air became a resource measured in minutes, sometimes hours. Prague chronicles described cases where the condemned was locked inside and buried immediately. In others, the coffin was left above ground. Witnesses watched as the victim pounded on the glass, breath fogging the surface, panic escalating into exhaustion. Physical evidence survives. A German noble's crypt inventory lists crystalline sarcophagi used as deterrents against betrayal. Austrian records from 1712 describe the sentence of Baroness Anna von Klee, sealed inside a glass coffin for 3 days. After 24 hours, attendants noted silence. After that, nothing. Why glass transparency multiplied terror. Every passerby could see punishment unfolding in real time. Rivals, servants, citizens, there was no hiding from the gaze of the city. The victim was exposed completely, reduced to an object lesson. The punishment marked twice. First, by the method. Second, by the memory it burned into public consciousness. By the early 1800s, such devices fell out of legal favor. Executions moved behind walls. Death became quieter, more bureaucratic, but the idea lingered. Glass coffins reappeared in Gothic fiction, whispered histories, and cautionary tales passed down through generations. The lesson endured. Public spectacle doesn't just punish the victim, it infects the crowd. And if silence could kill through suffocation, the next device ensured silence would last forever, by removing the very tool of speech. Number 18, the tongue terror. What if one sentence, one rumor, one truth cost you your voice forever? The tongue terror was designed for societies that feared words as much as weapons. Its earliest references appear in Roman legal texts, but it reached its most systematic use during the Inquisition, particularly in Spain and Italy during the 1500s. Forged from iron, the device clamped onto the tongue and tore it free with a violent twist or pull. Spanish inquisitors kept meticulous records. Toledo 1575, 24 tongue extractions in a single year, each verdict written in identical language, cold, precise, final. Who received this sentence? Blasphemers, heretics, political dissenters, poets, satirists, anyone whose speech threatened authority. Judges used the device strategically. The threat alone often forced confessions. In Florence, a chronicler writes of a poet condemned for satire who survived the extraction but never spoke again. His silence became a warning more powerful than his words ever were. The pain was instant and legendary. A scream, then only blood. Venetian surgeons studied the wounds, producing early treatises on hemorrhage control based on these injuries. The irony was not lost on later historians. Knowledge advanced on the backs of the mutilated. A 17th-century priest observed, the tongue terror leaves society changed. Rumors travel faster but with less truth. Markets and taverns became quieter. People avoided conversation. Gestures and symbols replaced speech. Underground networks of communication formed using coded marks and signs. As printing spread, tongue-tearing declined. Ideas became harder to silence physically, but the method never vanished entirely. The more authorities tried to control speech, the more dangerous surviving words became. And from lost speech, punishment moved toward lost breath, toward devices that made every heartbeat a countdown. From lost breath, punishment moved toward something even more calculated, not suffocation, not mutilation, but compression, the slow, methodical destruction of the body from the inside out. Number 17, the crocodile tube. Some devices borrow fear from the animal world. Others turn the human body into raw material. The crocodile tube did both. Appearing in Russian and Eastern European torture archives in the 1700s, the crocodile tube was used primarily against traitors accused of espionage, enemy officers, and political prisoners whose deaths needed to send a message. Its construction was crude but terrifyingly effective. A long, narrow iron cylinder, just wide enough for a human body, arms pinned, legs trapped, no room to move. Some versions were decorated with iron ridges shaped like scales or jaws, giving rise to its name. Once the victim was forced inside, the tube was sealed. Then the compression began. Guards applied screws, levers, or suspended weights, tightening the metal inch by inch. Ribs cracked first, then organs shifted. Lungs collapsed slowly, forcing shallow, panicked breaths. Russian state papers from 1751 record 12 military traitors sentenced to the tube in a single month. An executioner in Moscow later bragged that bones snapped as easy as firewood. But death did not come quickly. Medical examiners noted that pressure kills differently. Blood vessels burst, consciousness lingered. Victims remained aware long after movement became impossible. Folktales exaggerated the horror, describing bodies reduced to pulp. The reality was worse, it was slower. The tube's reputation spread fast. Enemies of the Tsar reportedly deserted rather than risk capture. In rural Poland, parents warned rebellious sons with bedtime stories of men who disappeared into iron cylinders and never came back out. By the late 1800s, gunpowder and exile replaced such spectacle. The crocodile tube faded from use, but its legacy remains clear. Once technology is applied to punishment, it rarely stops at necessity. It learns to optimize suffering. Number 16, the iron spider. If the tube destroyed from within, the iron spider was designed to perform pain. This was not a hidden punishment, it was theater. The iron spider appeared in German city-states during the 1500s, favored by courts that believed justice needed an audience. The device consisted of 4 to 6 curved iron hooks welded onto a central handle resembling a spider's body. Blacksmiths competed to improve it: sharper hooks, wider reach, better grip. Guild records show craftsmen paid bonuses for innovations that made punishment more instructive. The execution followed a brutal script. The iron was heated until it glowed red. The condemned, usually men accused of rebellion, attempted regicide, or treason, were chained upright. Nobles or bishops often watched from raised platforms. The executioner pressed the hooks into flesh, then twisted. Hooks tore into arms, legs, chest, sometimes the face. Each rotation ripped skin, muscle, and tendon. Blood ran freely. Eyewitness Hans Richter wrote in Augsburg, 1587, "It ran like melted wax." Surgeons stood by not to save lives but to observe. Torn veins and shredded tissue became lessons. City records from Dresden list 21 spiderings between 1550 and 1600. Only 3 victims survived longer than a week. Most died from blood loss or infection. Some were granted mercy at the end, a dagger through the heart to close the performance. Families were sometimes forced to watch. The humiliation was as important as the pain. Reputation died alongside the body. The word spidered entered local dialects, meaning ruined beyond repair. From tearing flesh, punishment moved toward something colder, more clinical, a chair that turned death into an experiment. Number 15, the Chinese death chair. Not all cruelty belongs to distant centuries. Modernity invented its own terrors. The Chinese death chair emerged in the late 19th century as cities sought efficient, modern methods of execution. First appearing in Shanghai, it replaced blades and fire with electricity. Foreign newspapers watched closely. American and British reports from 1909 describe electric justice in the Orient, noting over 25 executions in the chair during its first year alone. The process was deliberately scientific. The condemned was strapped upright. Copper plates pressed against bare skin. Wires ran to a control panel hidden behind a screen. The executioner adjusted voltage carefully, sometimes too carefully. Instead of a single fatal surge, current was increased slowly. Victims remained conscious, bodies jerked violently, teeth shattered from clenched jaws. Witnesses described smoke rising from scorched flesh. Dr. Ling Ju, who conducted autopsies, wrote that the body burned from the inside outward. Official records from 1911 to 1923 list 113 executions in Shanghai alone. Rumors spread that political enemies received higher voltage as a warning. Eventually, international pressure forced reforms, but the damage was done. The device influenced executions elsewhere, including electric chairs used in American prisons. Progress did not eliminate cruelty, it refined it, and after electricity, punishment returned to brute force. Sometimes all it took was one blow. Number 14, the head smasher. Speed and spectacle met in this device. The head smasher, known as the mazzetolo, stripped punishment of subtlety. Used in Italy during the 1700s, it consisted of a massive wooden mallet wielded by a trained executioner. The goal was simple: crush the skull with a single strike, but reality was rarely that clean. Vatican orders authorized its use in 1738. Sentencing records from Rome describe 74 executions between 1740 and 1806. Victims knelt, hands bound. One blow often dropped the body, but executioners frequently struck again and again until death was certain. Surgeons' notes from 1796 describe skulls shattered like crockery, brains exposed, sometimes still pulsing for seconds. Crowds gathered at dawn. Blood splatter reached spectators. In one 1768 execution, the wooden block split, sending fragments into the crowd and triggering panic. Authorities used the chaos to justify tighter public order laws. Eventually, even the church favored quieter methods. Guillotines replaced mallets, but the image endured. Justice by blunt force was unforgettable. And when bone and blood weren't enough, authorities turned to methods that choked life slowly, one breath at a time. Number 13, the garrote. Some tools turn air into currency. The garrote replaced rope with iron and patience with control. Used in ancient Rome, it returned to prominence in Spain during the 1800s, becoming an official execution method. In 1828, a royal decree declared, "Let iron silence those who threaten the peace." The condemned sat on a chair, wrists shackled, an iron collar closed around the neck. Behind it, a screw mechanism waited. The executioner turned the handle. Slowly, blood drained from the face. Eyes bulged, tongues swelled. If the screw struck the spinal cord, death came quickly. If not, minutes passed in silent agony. Spanish Ministry of Justice records list 736 garrote executions between 1832 and 1974. Franco's regime favored it for political prisoners. Inventors added a steel spike to speed death, but misalignment often made things worse. Some victims suffered longer. By 1975, Spain abolished the device, but relics remain: iron collars, screws frozen in place, symbols of a state that chose silence over mercy. From strangulation, punishment turned downward, toward limbs, toward breaking escape itself. Number 12, the boot. Pain multiplied by invention can destroy hope faster than bone. The boot appeared in Scottish and French torture chambers in the 1600s. It encased the leg in iron or wood. Wedges or screws applied pressure. Each turn splintered bone. Eyewitnesses in Edinburgh, 1678, counted 22 hammer blows in one session. Skin tore, marrow spilled. French court records describe prisoners losing both feet before speaking. The boot's power lay in control. Executioners could stop just short of death, then start again. In Covenanter trials, at least 30 boots were used in a single year. Only 3 victims walked unaided afterward. Fear spread faster than truth. Many confessed at the sight of it. By the late 1700s, reforms pushed the boot aside, but the phrase remained: to put the boot in, a legacy of merciless force. Number 11, the knee splitter. Smaller devices often hide worse fates. The knee splitter entered Renaissance courts as a precision tool of destruction. Iron bars lined with spikes closed around the bent knee. Screws drove the spikes inward. Cartilage shattered. Bones cracked. Spanish records from 1595 describe kneecaps reduced to gravel. Survivors couldn't run, couldn't work, couldn't escape memory. In small towns, ruined knees marked outcasts forever. At least 200 cases appear in French regional records between 1630 and 1660. The device faded by the 1800s. Cruelty didn't, it adapted. From shattered joints and broken legs, punishment moved upward again. Back to devices meant not just to injure, but to unmake a human being in front of witnesses. This is where cruelty stopped pretending to search for truth and began demanding memory. Number 10, the broken wheel. Few devices haunted Europe like the broken wheel. Also known as the Catherine wheel, it was neither symbolic nor rare. Court records from 16th century Germany, Switzerland, and France describe it in procedural detail, as if documenting construction rather than death. The device was simple: a wagon wheel, wooden spokes, iron rim. The victim was tied across it, limbs spread wide. Sometimes the wheel lay flat. Other times it was raised on a post so the crowd could see every movement. Then the executioner began. Using an iron bar, bones were smashed in a fixed order. Ankles first, then shins, knees, arms, thighs, each strike deliberate, each pause intentional. The goal was not speed, it was endurance. A Nuremberg execution record from 1587 describes Hans Mayer, a butcher accused of highway theft. He endured 12 blows. Witnesses noted he remained conscious. Afterward, his shattered body was woven through the spokes and lifted upright. He lived for hours, sometimes days. Priests recorded final confessions spoken through broken teeth. Families were often forbidden to retrieve bodies. Carrion birds finished what the executioner began. A Saxony registry lists 23 wheelings in a single year. Even by early modern standards, it was extreme. By the 18th century, reformers condemned the practice. Hanging replaced it. Then imprisonment, but the language remained. To be wheeled meant ruined beyond recovery, the body reduced to a warning. Number 9, the Spanish tickler. Not all torture needed size, some relied on repetition. The Spanish tickler, also called the cat's claw, was small enough to hide in one hand. Forged from steel, it had 4 or 5 curved prongs, sharpened just enough to tear without killing quickly. The method was simple: clamp, drag, repeat. Each pass peeled away layers of skin, muscle followed, veins opened, blood loss accumulated slowly. Infection finished the work. Inquisition records from Granada 1679 detail 41 ticklings in a single year. Most victims were accused of witchcraft, theft, or heresy. Surgeons documented exposed bone. They experimented with wine-soaked bandages. Most efforts failed. The device rarely killed outright. That was the point. Survivors bore scars that marked them permanently, public reminders that authority reached beneath skin. Rumors spread of soldiers using the tickler during wartime interrogations. Even after its official decline, homemade versions were seized by police in rural France as late as 1913. Pain didn't need to be fatal, it just needed to be unforgettable. Number 8, fish hooks. Sometimes punishment borrowed tools from daily life. Fish hooks entered torture practices across Russia, Poland, and parts of Eastern Europe between the 17th and 19th centuries. Large iron hooks were driven through flesh, sides, arms, jaws. Victims were strung up, suspended, or immobilized. Some hung for hours, others were left overnight. A Polish chronicle from 1757 describes 10 men pierced and hanging for a full day. Survivors spoke of nerve damage, fever, and wounds that never healed. Officials kept records vague. Doctors did not. Medical notes describe blood loss, torn muscle, and psychological collapse. The hook did more than hurt, it displayed ownership. Captured soldiers sometimes wore scars as proof of survival. In rare cases, shared suffering forged bonds, brotherhoods of the scarred. International treaties eventually outlawed such practices, but echoes remained in penal colonies and secret prisons. Pain, once normalized, resists erasure. Number 7, the wooden mule. Punishment doesn't always rush, sometimes it waits. The wooden mule appeared in French, Spanish, and Italian courts from the Renaissance onward. It was a triangular beam raised waist-high with a narrow ridge sharp enough to bite. The condemned was forced to straddle it. Weights were tied to the ankles. Gravity did the rest. Military records from the War of Spanish Succession list at least 114 mule punishments in 1707 alone. Soldiers accused of theft or desertion endured sessions lasting hours. The ridge cut through clothing, then skin, then deeper. A Milan court record from 1651 describes a baker who lost all sensation in one leg after 2 hours. The crowd always watched. Commanders lined up entire regiments to witness the lesson. Doctors protested by the 19th century, documenting paralysis and death from infection. The mule faded from use, but the phrase, riding the wooden horse, lived on. A metaphor for slow, bureaucratic suffering. Number 6, the iron cage. Some punishments destroyed not through injury, but exhaustion. The iron cage appeared in 17th century England and Germany. A cramped metal frame forced prisoners to stand upright, arms raised, wrists chained above the head. There was no room to sit. Sessions lasted hours, sometimes days. A London court record from 1692 confirms its use for minor crimes, vagrancy, defiance, unpaid debts. Victims fainted. Were revived, then locked back in. Manchester logs from 1703 list 37 victims in one summer. Many suffered dislocated shoulders, broken ribs, permanent nerve damage. Guards rarely offered aid. The goal wasn't confession, it was submission. One jailer wrote, "No man leaves the cage with his will intact." By the 1800s, reform replaced cages with treadmills and solitary cells. Different tools, same intention. As iron cages disappeared behind prison walls, punishment didn't grow kinder, it grew cleverer. Authorities learned something essential: pain fades, but humiliation spreads. A scar can be hidden, a broken bone can heal, but public shame follows a person everywhere, into markets, into work, into family memory. So justice stepped back into the square, not always with blood, but with ridicule. Number 5, the spiderweb cage exposure can be more lethal than blades. The spiderweb cage appeared in 17th century Bohemia and Silesia. It was a spherical iron frame, latticed like a web, suspended from beams or gallows in public squares. The condemned was locked inside, stripped, bound, and left there. Archival records from Prague document at least 29 cases between 1640 and 1689. The average sentence lasted 3 days, some stretched to a full week. Victims suffered dehydration, sunburn, hypothermia, insect bites, and madness. Merchants' diaries describe prisoners delirious by the second morning, mouths cracked, eyes unrecognizing. The city rotated the cage, every district had to see. Neighbors threw scraps, children mocked, rats gnawed at wounds, stones sometimes followed. Even survivors rarely returned to normal life. Public exposure killed reputation long before the body failed. Eventually, legal codes abandoned the practice. But circular cage imagery entered folk art, town gates, and warnings passed to children. The body survived, the identity didn't. Number 4, the iron saddle. Some punishments attacked dignity through stillness. The iron saddle was used in German, Russian, and Ottoman prisons throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Shaped like a narrow beam or ridge, it forced the condemned to sit on pain itself. Wrists were bound behind the back, weights tied to ankles. Hours passed, nerves inflamed, muscles seized. Blood flow collapsed. Bavarian criminal courts documented nearly 200 cases between 1670 and 1735. Average duration, 3 to 8 hours, enough to maim, not always enough to kill. Prison logs from St. Petersburg describe prisoners fainting, revived with cold water, then remounted. One magistrate wrote, "None forgets the saddle, some never walk upright again." Public saddle days turned punishment into display. Devices were placed in yards for all inmates to see. The saddle vanished with reform movements, but survivors carried its memory into posture, pain, and silence. Number 3, the pillory of shame had a face, it stood in the pillory. A wooden frame with holes for head and hands, the pillory dominated European justice systems for centuries. Thieves, liars, forgers, adulterers, anyone judged to have betrayed social trust. Between 1660 and 1800, London's Old Bailey recorded over 2,700 pillory sentences. The punishment wasn't the wood, it was the crowd, rotten food, mud, dead animals, stones, in rare cases knives. Pamphlets bragged of victims blinded or killed by mobs. Families watched reputations collapse in real time. Apprentices lost work. Names were remembered long after sentences ended. Occasionally, crowds turned sympathetic, but that was dangerous. Authorities feared mercy as much as rebellion. By the 1830s, most Western nations abolished the pillory. The word survived. To pillory someone still means public destruction. Number 2, the flute of shame. Some punishments sang. The flute of shame appeared in Germanic towns between the 16th and 18th centuries. Carved from wood or forged from iron, it locked around the neck and wrists, forcing the offender to hold it like an instrument. Musicians accused of poor performance were common targets, so were gossipers, debtors, drunkards. Nuremberg court records list over 300 flute sentences between 1570 and 1720. Victims were paraded through markets as crowds mocked them with songs. Some were forced to mime playing the silent instrument. No blood spilled, but careers ended. One historian wrote, "No song is so bitter as that played for shame." The flutes still stare from museum walls, grotesque faces carved into their ends, frozen laughter from another age. Number 1, the drunkard's cloak. When humiliation needed movement, justice took to the streets. The drunkard's cloak first appeared in 17th century England. It was a barrel, heavy, rough, open at both ends with holes cut for arms. Repeat offenders were forced to wear it while marching through town, sometimes with bells, sometimes singing. Newcastle records document over 120 cases between 1649 and 1672. Sentences lasted days. The barrel weighed up to 30 pounds. Wearers stumbled, collapsed, became jokes. Employers remembered. Families suffered. One preacher claimed the cloak cured thirst by drowning the soul in shame. By the late 18th century, temperance movements replaced spectacle with sermons, but the image endured, a person wearing failure for all to see. From iron claws to wooden frames, from shattered bones to broken reputations, each device reveals something deeper than cruelty. They reveal fear, fear of disorder, fear of dissent, fear of people who refuse to stay silent. The tools vanished, the instincts didn't. Because even when the devices disappear, the memory of punishment lingers, etched not just into bodies, but into culture, language, and law. And as long as power exists, so will the temptation to make suffering visible. Before you go. If these stories stayed with you, if they shocked you, disturbed you, or made you see history differently, make sure you subscribe. This channel exists to bring the darkest truths out of the shadows, and your support keeps these stories alive. Leave a comment below and tell me what you thought. Which story affected you the most? Which one surprised you? And I want to know, where are you watching from? History connects us across centuries and continents, and I read every comment. If you're ready to uncover more stories most people never hear, stay with us, because the past is never as distant as we think.